We are starting episode 11 of Is This a Dream? So let me know if you can hear me. All right, I see some people are jumping on. Is the audio and video okay? Welcome. I see more people logging on. Let me know if you can hear me okay. Hi, Allah. Yes. Okay, messages are coming through. Rob says yes. Verily says yes. Kristen, Kevin, Maury, Brooke, yes. Okay. See mostly people from LinkedIn. Okay, coming through from Facebook as well. Hello, Leora. Nader, George, Teresa, great. Periscope, YouTube, great. All right. Thanks for joining me. This is episode 11 of Is This a Dream? Thank you for your questions last time. We'll go through a few of them, and then we'll finish up this chapter on the ego today. So this is the book. Is This a Dream? Reflections on the Awakening Mind, with a foreword from Deepak Chopra. If you have the book, please do review it on Amazon so others can see whether it will be helpful to them or not. Good morning, Carolyn. Irie, good morning. Let's take a few moments. We'll spend in silence so we can all jump on together, get on the same page, and then we'll start with the questions. So take a few deep, easy breaths. Yeah, Prakash, Old Town Alexandria. All right. So the first question we have from last week is, what is the relationship between the three minds, what we've been talking about? Is the video coming through? Are you seeing me? No, it looks like the picture is not coming through. Let me see something here. It looks like the video is not there. I see that. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think it looks like the audio is still going through, but not the video. Have video. Looks like LinkedIn is working. Okay, let me try it here. All right, yes, audio, no video. So I'm gonna try going off and then coming back on, and we'll see if that works. All right, so bear with me. Might have to jump back on, but let's see. Lena says, this day is just like that. You know, some of these, I know that most people don't have video now, but some of these moments are very telling. And I think there are opportunities to see what's happening in different ways. So I'll try to jump back on. If it doesn't work, we may just have an audio conversation. So let's see how it works out. All right, so I'm going to stop the feed and then try to jump back on in a second. All right, so I restarted a feed, but I am still not seeing video. So let me change. Carla, you can see me. Great. All right. Seems awfully dark. Can you see? I just switched to another camera. So we'll try it with this. All right. You can see, I think the lighting is not so great. But let's make do with this. I'll try to put on a light as well. Norm says, yes, good video. Thanks, Norm. All right. I'll turn on a light. We'll make do. I don't think the camera is as good, but fuzzy, but it works, says Francisco. All right. Here we go. All is good for now. Functional. So we were on the question, what is the relationship between the three minds and the book? Is this a dream? It's awfully bright. So what is the relationship between the two? So the three minds that we've been talking about so many sessions is the core framework. This core framework, which can be translated into many different applications. All right, so it has a relevance, for example, in medicine. It has a relevance in physics. It has a relevance in society. So it's a core framework, a core understanding of identity that can be applied in many ways, including to one's own exploration of consciousness and identity. All right, so this is the three minds. It's this core framework. Now, the book itself, Is This a Dream?, is a series of reflections. The subtitle of the book is Reflections on the Awakening Mind. So the reflections in the book, they're very short. They're 2, 3, 4 pages maybe at a time. And the idea is by reflecting on them, not just reading them, it's not a book that's simply read through, but it stimulates certain kinds of thinking, certain reflections, certain kinds of awareness in a person that then can be seen through this framework of the three minds, right? So as we've said before, the three minds is a kind of framework or map, and it by itself doesn't do anything. It has to be applied either through existing frameworks in society, through existing programs, and through our own practice. So our own practice part is the book, all right, is the reflections. So Jennifer says, please review briefly. I will in just a moment. So the book, Is This a Dream?, is a series of reflections, meaning what? In this process of becoming more aware of ourselves, right? Part of which we're doing right now, right? Where we start with a brief meditative moment. We try to see through the words that we're talking about right now. It's not only about the concepts we're sharing. So this moment right now where we're communicating is an active practice of recognizing the deeper nature of things while being able to function and translate in the world. So this is one of the practices of self-awareness that is recommended. right? If a person asks, how do we do this? How do we recognize our deeper nature? Then there's a practice of, in Vedanta, it's called Shravanam, Mananam, Nididhyasanam, right? Shravanam is hearing, listening to what is true, listening to the subtler nature of what we are and what the world is, right? Because of all the stories we hear, we need to hear a fuller story, a more comprehensive story. So simply listening, hearing, this is called Shravanam. This is one of the key steps. The next key step is Mananam. Mananam it's the root where the word mind comes from, Mananam. And Mananam is reflecting. And that's why the book is called Reflections on the Awakening Mind, right? Reading it or hearing is the Shravanam part. But then putting the book aside and saying, mapping it to, my own experience. What is it like here? What happens in this situation? How about the dream? How about at work? This is mananam. This is the reflecting part. So the book is specifically helping with those two steps. Shravanam, which is hearing a fuller story, and then mananam, which is reflecting on it. And the third step is nididhyasanam, which is assimilating, right? Living it. So this is in meditation, right? Whether it's with open eyes or with closed eyes, having heard and then having reflected in meditation, seeing if the recognition and the boundaries start to dissolve and how they start to dissolve. And then, if you're meditating with the eyes closed, when opening the eyes, recognizing what happens with boundaries. Just like when you fill out a form online, right? You type in your name, for example, or email, for example. That's called populating a field, right? The field populates with your name. Similarly, when the eyes are opening, the field of our awareness populates with boundaries, right? The root of those boundaries is there, even if the eyes are closed. And as the eyes open, the boundaries become more evident. So recognizing this in real time is nididhyasanam, and resting as that awareness. So this process, Shravanam, Mananam, Nididhyasanam, is the way to increase awareness. It's the prescribed way in Vedanta, cyclically, hearing, listening, reflecting, assimilating, and on, back and forth, over and over. And the first two steps in that is what the book helps with. Now, as this process unfolds, making sense of how it's happening, and especially if we're interested in working in the world, how does this apply to different situations? This is where the three minds framework really helps, right? Seeing the three minds as constellations or configurations of identity can help us see exactly how they are relevant in different fields in the world. All right, so this is the answer to that first question on the relationship between the three minds and the book. Now, it's also relevant here in terms of society, right? Not just in particular fields, but even if you look at civics, right? For example, in the United States, there's a major election happening, right? So we're seeing political polarization, all of this kind of polarization, the ideas behind social programs, right? Behind political programs, it's all based on identity, right? Usually it's not at the level of talking about first mind or second mind, but it is talking about how broadly we move beyond just an individual identity, right? Because if it's my identity just as me, then there are certain actions that I will take, right? But somebody who's not included as part of me, or part of the sense of family that is I, or part of the community that we live in that we feel is I, then they're left outside the circle. And this naturally has impact on our policies and our programs. Right? So it's not necessarily talking about a second mind, third mind. However, the same basic mechanism is at play. We're talking about identity and boundary and how far and subtle that expands to include other bodies, other personalities, right? And how much we see others as identical to us at the level of town, community, species, living beings, planet. And we can see that people who have different identities will favor different policies. So looking into identity, releasing the trauma that is associated with certain identities, and recognizing a broader identity will have direct impacts on social programs. All right. All right, so the next question is, it says, thank you for challenging beliefs and assumptions. Simply put, would that imply that subtle organs of perception, so we're talking about perception here, would that imply that subtle organs of perception are connected to identity and not to the body? So as we're talking about identity, what is the role of perception? Norman Chen says identity and boundary. Yes, identity and boundary is the core that applies to pretty much any situation. So, what does this have to do with perception? Does it imply that subtle organs of perception are connected to the identity and not to the body? So somebody asked earlier about a review of the three minds. I'll do it very briefly here because we've done it quite extensively in many different talks. All right, so very briefly, a first mind identity is the experience of individuality, and an experience that is restricted only to individuality. And it's usually experienced in association with the body, that what I am is this body. What I am is this particular mind, which is in my head. And everything else is not me, it's outside of me. So this boundary between me and the world, that configuration of mind is called the first mind. The second mind configuration is when that identity is no longer restricted within this boundary. Right? So the sense of I is no longer particular to only this body or this mind, but it's a broader expanse. It's like the ocean in which many waves arise. I is the second mind in which first mind experiences arise and subside. Right? And finally, the third mind is the potentiality itself that appears as any experience, whether through the second mind or the first mind. So this is not only a strategic or practical framework, it is a metaphysical framework where we're actually making a comment, taking a position on the nature of the world. And we're saying essentially it is this potential, what we might call consciousness, which differentiates and appears as this balance of unity and diversity through the second mind perspective, this broad vision. And when further constricted, appears as a separate individual that is disconnected or different and separate from the rest of the world. Right? And paradoxically here, the real beauty of diversity is appreciated as the second mind, because in the first mind, that the difference is a source of fear because of the sense of separateness and the sense of competition and the sense of scarcity. Because of all these, the diversity is not as appreciated in the first mind. But as that identity broadens and the many waves are recognized, big waves, small waves, tall waves, short waves, all kinds of waves, then that diversity, that beauty really comes out. All right. So back to this question here, does it imply that the subtle organs of perception are connected to identity and not to the body? So from the first mind perspective, the way we talk about perception is that light reflects. For example, the way you're seeing this screen now is light is reflecting from the screen and entering your eye, striking the retina. The retina creates an electrochemical impulse. It travels along the optic nerve to the back of the brain, and then the brain interprets it, and then the image is seen, right? This is the story of perception in the first mind, from the first mind perspective. And from the first mind perspective, it is true. Now, from this perspective, what is a relationship of perception and the organ of perception? Let's talk about the eye in this case. All right, let's pause for a second. Notice the silence here. So what is the relationship between the eyes and the actual perceiving? In the first mind, the eyes are an independent organ. And this eye is the organ that does the seeing. It is the instrument of sight. The eye is needed to capture the rays of light that are reflected from any object and to translate that light into an electrical signal and transmit it. So the eye is an organ that allows perception or that perceives. This is the view through the first mind. Now, what is the view of the second mind? Right? As the second mind, the fundamental identity is not as a discrete physical thing, right? It is as a broader field of consciousness. So as the second mind, the eye, rather than simply being an organ that sees, the eye itself is seen, right? The eye itself is seen, meaning not that we're physically seeing that eye, but then the eye itself is not fundamentally different than the screen which it sees, right? Both are co-arising out of this deeper field of consciousness, right? After all, the eye cannot see itself, right? The eye cannot see itself. The eye can see everything else but itself. So in this deeper field as consciousness itself, the eye represents or is symbolic of the process of seeing. So it is not the eye that sees, but the eye represents the process of seeing. It is what the process of seeing looks like, so to speak. Right? As the second mind, the ears and the auditory canal and the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, and the nerve associated with that, right? The cranial nerve associated with hearing, all of these are representations of the process of hearing. As the first mind, the ear is a physical, distinct thing that is required to hear. You see the difference. The first mind physicalizes everything and makes it an independent organ. The second mind perspective sees even that which is physical, that which appears as physical to the first mind. The second mind recognizes it as a co-arising, as a perceptual experience, right? What is the ear after all? It is a sight, maybe a sound if you touch it, right? A texture. And when you put all of these together, we have what we call an ear, as if it is an external independent object that is not in awareness. But as the second mind, we are saying that even this ear, this nose, this tongue, this skin, finger, eye, These are perceptual experiences of awareness. And the fact that they're related to particular kinds of experience, for example, the awareness of the eye is related to visual experience, right? This simply represents that cluster of experiences, a particular channel of experience, we can say. And this mind has many channels through which it experiences. That's why some people talk about ESP, extrasensory perception, right? What is the organ for extrasensory perception? As far as we know, there are only these 5 organs: eyes, nose, tongue, skin, and ear, right? But if there is such a thing as extrasensory perception, what is the organ for that? Well, there is no organ because it's not fully represented in our society. So it is a channel of this deeper mind, of what we call the second mind. And this is also why some people experience synesthesia, right? At the first mind level, it's because there is some kind of cross wiring, we might say, right? But from the second mind level, what we say is that even these 5 experiences, 5 channels of experience, seeing, hearing, tasting, so on, even these 5 channels of experiences are differentiations of a core mind. So if this is the second mind, let's say, this is seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, right? So the 5 that appear different, the 5 channels of sensing, which appear different if we only look at the outside. If we only look at these, they look separate, right? But when we see the whole picture, we see that in fact, there is a deeper source for these 5 apparently different functions. And a synesthesia would happen at these intersections, right? Before they differentiate into separation. So first mind perception is at this level, when we see only the differentiated perceptions and take them as independent objects: eyes, ears, nose. Second mind sees them here at this level. Like the roots of trees, Carmela Boyce says. Yes, like the roots of trees. Now I'm giving a limited metaphor because this palm is separate and different from the fingers, which is not the case for the second mind. The second mind permeates and alone is, and differentiates itself as the apparent changes, right? Much like ocean and wave, or much like air and wind, right? Air in motion is wind. There is nothing but air in wind. If air is removed, wind cannot exist. So similarly, what we call eyes, ears, nose are apparently different, apparently external, but when that deeper second mind is removed, these don't exist as independent entities because their essence is this mind self-modifying as perception. So having said that, let's look at the question again. Would that imply that the subtle organs of perception are connected to identity and not to the body? Yes. When we say the subtle organs of perception, there are the gross organs and the subtle organs. The gross organs are that which we interpret and say are physical: the ears, the nose, the eyes, right? These are the gross organs of perception. The subtle organs of perception are the mental process, right? And we're using mind in the second mind orientation here, in the sense of the second mind here. The subtle organs of perception are the mental processes which are partially represented by those perceptions we call eyes, ears, nose. All right? So all that is a long answer, and the short answer is yes. The subtle organs of perception are connected to identity because, which identity? The second mind identity, its subtle, its perceptions, its channels are these subtle, what we call the subtle organs. And their manifestation, or their symbolic nature, is what we call the individual organs. Right? So what we're talking about here is how the third mind, how this potentiality apparently modifies as this world. Right? So the context is important here. We're not discussing what is ultimate truth. We're not discussing what is the common method of perception in science. We're actually in a middle ground right now, where we're talking about, we're not simply saying consciousness is everything and that's the end of the story. We're saying, okay, if something like consciousness is the fundamental nature of this reality, right, or whichever word someone wants to use, then how does it apparently modify? How does it connect with our apparently physical reality? That intersection is what we're exploring through perception. Right? So why is it that you can close your eyes and you can easily see the face of your loved one? Right? Because that vision is ultimately of the mind. It is the mind's vision. So too, even when you see this right now, the screen you see, the face you're seeing is the mind's vision. The eye is not enough. The brain is not enough. The mind also has to be present for there to be vision. Right? And if you want, these appear to be two different visual fields, two different perceptual fields, where if you close your eyes and you see the face of a loved one, right? And now you open your eyes and you see a screen, or if you look to the side, you might see a wall, a different visual field. But if you focus, you can superimpose the vision of your loved one's face on the wall as if it were a portrait, right? Depending on how you have used your mind, how you've trained your mind. If you wish, you can superimpose that and see this picture that was in the mind on the wall. So why can you do that? To different extents. It might not be so vivid. It might be very vivid. It'll be different for everyone. But the very fact that we can do that from the second mind perspective is because this world is fundamentally mental to begin with. That there is no distinct line between in here and out there. That boundary itself is a mental boundary. So through recognizing this, we can start to appreciate how deeply these three minds permeate our experience. Right? It doesn't exclude perception. It doesn't exclude thought. The space of our thoughts, the space of our perceptions, and the space of the screen you're seeing now are all interconnected spaces, divided by the superimpositions of the first mind boundary. Cynthia says, being a visual artist, I relate to this concept because I see in pictures even as people are speaking. Yes. And even in terms of artists and art, the concept of positive space and negative space. Right? Positive space is what the mind is entrained to see. Right? Negative space is, for example, all the space that is surrounding the body would be considered negative space. So what is positive and what is negative is simply a matter of how the mind is trained. Right? Which is why some artwork that emphasizes negative space is striking. Right? The real attention there can go to the boundary. What is that boundary, the outline between the positive and negative space? And what is it about this boundary that has so much power to differentiate what I focus on and what I don't focus on? What is positive space and what is negative space? What is it about this boundary that is so powerful? Right? We can reflect on that, and we will see that that boundary is directly related to our own sense of identity and what we are. Someone says, so a key to the teaching being able to shift our attention at will consciously between the first and second mind, as opposed to being led around unconsciously by the first mind perspective. Where your attention is, that is where your identification will be. Yes, where the attention is. And the more we see the ways in which attention and identity and perspective can be used, it's really like the work of an artist, right? Seeing that based on how attention and boundary and identity are used, the world is experienced differently. And one's own identity and the identity of others is experienced differently. And then it's simply choosing the setting that works. All right. Please talk about how to broaden the perception scale. Looks like our video is holding up. All right. How to broaden the perception scale. So when I talk about these things, what I usually focus on is simply this process of recognizing identity. I know it's a subtle topic. I don't directly talk about practices to open up perception, for example, because to me, that's not really the goal, right? If I look at, for example, what is happening in society now, right? The goal is really to introspect into one's identity and to recognize what are the boundaries of my identity, right? And that's the willingness to reflect, to think, to be mindful, to meditate, these processes of going inwards and recognizing how what is inwards superimposes itself on what is apparently external. This to me is the most important thing, right? In all fields. Now, the opening up of perception, the opening the doors of perception, so to speak, is a part of that as our identity broadens. As we see more and more of what we are, as the mind relaxes, right? What is a tense mind? One way to see a tense mind is that mind which constricts itself, restricts itself, concretizes itself, casts itself in a mold, right? If you think about a fractured forearm, you might get a cast, right? What does the cast do? It immobilizes those bones so that they can heal in position. They can remain in position. Well, that's the opposite of what we want, what we might want the mind to do, right? When the mind takes on a certain mold of identity, then let's say when we're talking about perception, it only perceives through these channels, right? Oh, this is impossible. That's impossible. This can't happen. There's no evidence for this. All of this is said through the first mind perspective based on first mind assumptions of the nature of the world, right? And from the first mind perspective, they can happen. It's true. Because as long as those are the assumptions and that is the casting of that mind, then it can only operate through certain configurations, right? Just like I was playing tennis the other day and I was thinking like, so when you serve, you got to raise your arm up and strike the ball to serve, right? Now, if your arm won't go up to serve, you can't serve like that. You have to hit ground strokes, right? So if the shoulder is restricted, if the shoulder is cast in a mold, then you can't serve the ball in tennis. right? It can only operate on this plane, in this mostly horizontal plane. But to serve the ball effectively, the arm has to go up and operate in the vertical plane, right? So it loses a function by virtue of restricting its configuration. And the exact same is true for the mind. By virtue of restricting the mind to a first mind configuration, it loses certain channels of sensation and expression, right? It's not that it can't do them. It's not that they're inherently unavailable. It's all here, always. However, they simply cannot be accessed without that mind relaxing itself, right? And accessing its less differentiated nature. So there are many, you can look up sources online. I'm sure there are many people who talk about that. However, I feel that this can become a distraction when the goal is to increase perception and the goal is not to recognize one's identity, right? And this is classically seen because without having the identity being grounded, anything we have can become a loose cannon, as we see in society now. The technologies we've developed are far beyond our own awareness of ourselves and how to manage these, right? So focus on the Shravanam, Mananam, Nididhyasanam, on the hearing and then reflecting for yourself, not simply believing what anybody's saying, reflecting, is this true? How might it be true? And then in meditation or mindful practices, assimilating it and then living it in this waking world. Living it in the world is very important so that we don't create a dichotomy in the life between just being inside and being outside, right? Seeing through even that boundary is important. This is the field of experience. This here is the field of consciousness. So we're almost at time here. So we're finishing up the chapter, What is the Ego? So we'll just take a couple of these questions. There's one practice I included in the book on page 22. I put 5 fill in the blanks. This is something you can try if you wish at home. And these are, my name is blank, right? You can fill in the blank. I was born on blank. You can give your birth date. I love blank. It can be a person, place, event, thing, anything. My pet peeve is blank. And I wish I could blank. Right, so the 5 blanks. My name is blank. I was born on. I love. My pet peeve is. And I wish I could. Right. So when you fill these in, you'll have a good feeling for your individual identity, for your personality identity. Right. It kind of gives a snapshot of that. And then one thing you can do is then try to describe yourself without using those modifiers, without talking about your name or your birth date or what you like or what you don't like or any of these 5. Try to see what aspect of you is here now that is not modified in these 5 ways. Right? This is a practice of manana. So you can see different aspects of yourself. Because sometimes when these 5 identifiers become very strong, they occlude the deeper vision of what we are. We want to be able to use these identifiers, function as them, function through them, and yet also not to be restricted only to these. All right. So, what is it that sees through the ego? Wouldn't that just be another ego, another identity? This will be the last question. Yes, so in meditation, as one, let's say, goes to a witnessing kind of awareness, right? So witnessing is witnessing both one's personality and the world, right? It's a kind of meta subject, right? The question is, isn't that just another kind of ego, another kind of identity? And yes, it is. Whether we call it ego or not, some people might, traditionally in spirituality, it's not called ego. Some people may or may not call it ego. But isn't it another kind of identity? Yes, it is. It is another kind of identity. As long as there's some kind of flux between what is being perceived and the identity of what one is, and there's always this differentiation, right? There's always this another kind of identity. There's the self and there's the not self. And this can occur at many different levels, depending on what kind of practice we're doing. So the only time where that's not the case is when all of this is dropped, right? When this witnessing and the witness has merged completely, and when there's no longer any looking at something or noticing something, right? It's not only a mindfulness practice now. It's not noticing the thoughts, it's not noticing the emotions, noticing the body. This is all an effective practice. But where the witnessing and the witnessed merge, that absolute silence, right? So this would not be considered another identity that is witnessing something, or another kind of ego that is witnessing something. Now, as this functions in the world, then yes, the ego comes back. And I'm using ego here as individuality, as a needed and wonderful function, right? I'm not talking about eradicating the ego. So the question again was, what is it that sees through the ego? Wouldn't that just be another ego? So as long as we're witnessing the ego, or witnessing what we call reality, or witnessing the mind, then yes, there's always these layers until that there's complete emergence of that, and in that absolute silence, right? That's actually what this symbolizes, right? One is, it's the balance of polarities, right? Right side of the body, left side of the body, the balance of polarities, right? One is the subject and the object are one. You and I are one. So there's a deep meaning to this, and also an actual effect of balancing polarities by bringing these two together. So with that, we'll stop here. We finished this chapter, What is the Ego? It's chapter 3, and we'll move on next time. If you have questions, please do continue to write them. I'll look at them over the week, and then we will address them next time.